Welcome back, my friends, to the Sweet Spot, where IT leaders share the insight with other leaders and others that want to lead. My name is Carlos Vargas, and I think every week I have my two co-hosts, Howard Holton and Paul Lewis.
Hey there. How's it going?
Very good. And you guys?
That's fine. Pretty good. Back home for a few days anyhow.
A couple days before my big vacay. Off for a couple of weeks, seeing the sights.
So we're gonna have to find. Are we gonna have to find a filler? Or are we gonna have to find a?
You need a filler next week. Yes.
Okay. Well, I have a couple, so that shouldn't be terrible. Matter of fact, so last week I was at B-Sides, then Black Hat, then DEF CON.
Right.
Which was a lot of badges to cycle through in a week, especially considering all the party badges that you end up getting. Right. I went and drove exotic race cars on a racetrack.
Nice.
Tuesday night, so that was a ton of fun. Talk to some security founders that would like to be that would be happy to join our podcast. So
interesting. All right.
Hopefully we'll have some special guests for the next few weeks.
Did you provide insights to them that they didn't have themselves?
Apparently.
Excellent.
Because they're excited about coming on our podcast, knowing it's not a security focused podcast.
Interesting.
Right. And so they were, I was a little surprised, right? Because traditionally security focused folks don't tend to leap to non-security podcasts.
They don't get out of their domain.
Right. But I think I think security is one of those things, while we may not all need to be implementers of, while we may not all be red and blue teaming and purple teaming, while we may not all, have a remit directly associated with security, I think it's something we should all be aware of, at least, and a little more than just tangentially aware of, right? I think we should all be able to carry on let's say an executive level conversation on security. You don't need to know the details. It's not critical any more than, Paul, how much do you dig into modern application development frameworks today?
It's constant.
Right.
But in fairness, I have an engineering team who builds software.
Sure, but you're not talking about the nuances in particular versions of the development language, right?
No, I am not.
You're probably getting as deep as, right, this is kind of what our stack looks like and why we chose that stack.
Right. Here's our technology principles. And I agree with security that everybody needs to have conversations, because there's such parallels between personal security and corporate security, and the decisions you need to make for your individual data is just as important as the decisions you need to make for the corporate data.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things I got involved with when we were at Hitachi was in our trip to Japan, I met a very, very interesting Japanese gentleman, worked for Hitachi Limited and was a PhD student. Mm-hmm. And his specific PhD paper, which he was working on, his doctoral thesis, was on the definition of trust and how it applies to things involving machines.
Interesting.
And it was super interesting because we don't really think about trust. It is like, if I say, who do you trust or what do you trust? There's things that pop into your head. Like when we talk conceptually about trust and it comes up in conversation, there's like an emotion that comes along with trust. I trust my mother, I trust my father, there's a few friends I trust, right? But when we really drill into trust, quantifying trust is an incredibly complex thing to do. And what he postulated was trust is a purely human conceit. And we've assigned trust as though it means something within this, let's call it other space, right? I trust you because we have a relationship. There's not actually any other reason that I trust you.
Right.
And then I trust those things that I have determined to be infallible. I trust that gravity will work. I trust, right, that the air is breathable. I don't trust clean anymore, right? Like there's very few fundamental things that I trust.
Right.
I trust that bees are important, I guess. You know what I mean? Like there's things that I fundamentally that I trust. To the point where I got into a conversation with someone about flat Earth. Also, I'm fine if this becomes our discussion point. I was really just trying to make it hard for Carlos to lose.
Yeah, I'm like trying to go like.
I would like you to connect bees to this topic.
Right. But I was talking to somebody today and they said, you know, it was on a topic of like what kind of weird things do people believe? And it wasn't supposed to get into conspiracies. It was just supposed to be like, you know, what are things that are, you know, that people believe? And it turned to flat earth. And I have a friend who was a flat earther. And he was a flat earther, you know, the reasons behind it are kind of long and varied, but it's a combination of exposure and trust. And if you think the only reason we know for sure the world is not flat is because of pictures taken from space, you don't trust that. I can't verify that with my own eyes.
Right.
I'm never going to go. The likelihood that I'm going to go to space is the same that I'm going to be bit by a shark and win the lottery in the same week.
Right.
Right. There's more lottery winners.
However, more likely, yes.
But I was talking to him and I'm like, that's not how we know the earth is flat. And he goes, what do you mean? How do we know the earth is flat? And he was very dismissive in it. Right. Because he had made his decision. And he didn't trust those people that claim to have taken pictures from space. And I said, well, we know the earth is round because of boats. And he goes, how does that work? And we went to high school together. That's how I knew him. And we both lived in California. We, you know, living in California, it doesn't matter how far in California you live from the ocean. You've been to the ocean 100 times, right?
Right.
You've stood in the sand and watched the water. And I said, you've been to the ocean many times, just like I have. He says, yeah. I said, so when a ship is sailing into port, when it's coming closer to you, what do you see first? And he goes, and I said, you see the sail, you see the mast, you see the top of it. You see that flag that's waving. And he goes, yeah, that's exactly what you see. I said, why? It's the smallest part of the boat. And he goes, what do you mean? And I said, think about it. The biggest part of the boat is the hull.
Right.
Why do you see the top of the mast first? Why do you see that flag first? Right? If the goal was to see the flag first and the earth was flat, you'd paint the hull the color of the flag.
Right.
Right? But because the earth is curved, you see the tallest part first, because it's what appears as you circle the horizon.
Right.
And he goes, holy crap, I've seen that. And I didn't know, like I never thought about it before, but I have seen that. Why don't they teach that in school? And I said, well, they actually do, but they don't.
Depends which school you go to, I guess.
Well, we went to the same school, so that's how they taught it in school. But unless you're paying attention, there's nothing personal about that. So why would you remember it?
Right. Plus, he probably didn't have a firm belief of flat Earth in school.
Nothing. It had never come up.
It was relatively recent.
Right. You assumed the Earth was round because everyone told you your whole life, and it's not until later that it's this conspiracy using trick photography.
You're questioning authority.
Right. But you're doing it in the wrong way, right? And all of a sudden it changed for him because he could trust his own eyes. And that was really what it came down to for him, was he didn't have the ability to trust someone as easy as it is to manipulate photography. But he could absolutely remember standing on the dock. He could absolutely go to the edge of the water, and someone that he trusted, me, right, as someone who's intelligent, was able to talk him through why this works. And he knows that's an experiment he could repeat himself. And he's like, oh my God, I can't believe I've been wrong all these years.
Yeah. Did that philosophy extend to oxygen in the air, molecules and atoms, other things he can't witness?
No, because one, he doesn't have to witness those. Like, we don't have to witness those, right? You could absolutely, like, what's the argument? We don't actually breathe. Okay?
Right. Or we're not made up of molecules and atoms.
Sure. And you could absolutely do that. But again, right, you could also take a piece of skin, put it on a slide and put it in a microscope and do that yourself.
Right.
Once again, you're not going to space. Right. And so I don't have to trust another person. Sure, at some point, like, we get into the inane definition of trust. Do I trust the person that made the microscope? Do I trust, you know what I mean?
You're making this too easy for Carlos, but yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking about that.
He's just gonna take it.
I drink coffee. I don't drink bourbon or vodka or anything like that. I think I'm gonna have to switch, because holy cow, to come from a bird to a plane to a bee, are we screwed somewhere? Like, how do we trust anything? How do we trust in the system?
So let's talk about trust, and let's talk about trust within the context of security, right? So at Black Hat this year, there's a relatively new topic Not that it wasn't there last year, but it is the number one topic. It is, when you look at kind of, sure, everybody's talking about endpoint security, securing your mobile phone, blah, 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 blah. But there's a relatively new one. And I think it's really worth a discussion. I think it's really worth all of our audience having not a thorough understanding, but a better than no understanding of this topic. And it's API security. You may also think of it as supply chain security or software supply chain security, because API security is a facet of what is the larger conversation around supply chain security. In a nutshell, supply chain security is the security of every single piece that makes up your software stack. Okay, within that, the scariest one is API security. And API security is not the process to which you procure software, although it is because of how we traditionally do that. It effectively is the security of the programming interfaces used to exchange data from application piece to application piece. If you
exchange data or invoke process.
Correct.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Right.
Which could be just as dangerous, because that process you could be invoking is start train.
Sure.
Yeah.
Or change track.
Right.
Yep.
Exactly.
And so everything kind of comes down to an API. That was something we moved to more than a decade ago, right? I can provision core storage using command line scripts that I wrote myself by invoking the API.
Right.
Right. I can deprovision core storage using scripts I wrote from the API. Right?
Yeah.
From the command line. No vendor provided user interface required.
Right.
Okay. So it's estimated that people underestimate the number of APIs that are in their organization by anywhere from 40% to 800%.
Because a substantial amount of the APIs are unused.
They're not aware of them. They're poorly documented. Some of them are zombies.
Right.
Right. A company that I'm well aware of that makes traditional storage products has several undocumented APIs in their application that they developed, deployed, and failed to complete and just abandoned.
I see.
But they're still there. They're still working. They would still respond. And yet you as the purchaser probably have no idea they even exist because they don't appear in the documentation.
Right.
Right. And they certainly don't talk about them as part of the sales process because they've abandoned them.
Right.
But abandoned doesn't mean removed. Abandoned doesn't mean secured.
Right.
And if we look at software that we do develop, almost all of that now is API driven. Right.
Yep.
Because we've moved
By design. It's architected.
It is architected to be API driven because we've moved to a kind of a micro segmented design pattern, right? We design everything as a standalone component in the smallest possible form so that it is replaceable, so that it is upgradable. It's kind of a core tenet to agile.
That's right.
Development, right?
Yeah. They're microservices to which speak to each other via an API.
Correct. A series of APIs.
Yeah. And
this is where it starts to get scary, because if as a software developer, I need to get data from one microservice to another microservice, I look for a library that provides an API that provides that data.
Mm-hmm.
I don't tend to look any further than that. As in, if I need 3 components of data, right? Like I need current exchange rate and volume, and those are the things that I'm looking to do. There may be 9,000 other things available within that API that I completely and utterly disregard.
Right.
Because I just need to figure out how do I exchange the volume and the exchange rate. So that's 3 things, right?
Yeah.
Source.
There are many commands to a single API. You are only using 2 that are relevant to you. Correct.
But guess what? I can't turn off the other, what did I say, 9,000? So 8,997 parts of the API, right? Commands, I can't turn them off. I have no control over that whatsoever. They are simply available and unused.
Right.
Right. And so the scary part becomes a lot of what we look for in security is things that are malformed. Right. That activity should not take place that way. Right. SQL injection is a great kind of example. Right. While what makes it scary and what makes it a really good example is SQL injection. Why it worked was because it was valid SQL commands. Right? Kind of everybody knows the old null tables, Johnny null tables Wilson joke.
Right.
Right. What makes API security what makes regular security so scary is the depth to which we go. There's a new Intel bias flaw that was found. Right, major flaw, hardware level, can't get around it, blah, 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 no fix for it, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. However, in order to enact it, you have to be an expert and you have to have console access. Right. So you're not like, that's not an easy one to execute. Sure, pants down, you have access to everything that's on that system, no problem. Right. A lot of the 0 days, a lot of the root attacks, right? They're all kind of similar in that fashion, in that a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been dealt with, and now you really have to be somewhat of an expert, right? You could argue the script kiddie has been long dead, if you remember those days, right? Where someone could download a script, change a couple of parameters, and execute it, and they were script kiddies. They weren't real hackers. They got access by executing scripts, and for the most part, we're pretty good at dealing with kind of the traditional script kiddie. So here's the scary part. The scary part is APIs give access to data as long as I execute the API properly. All of them are thoroughly, completely, and utterly documented and require nothing more than script kiddie knowledge necessary to execute them. That's frightening. And I can't just turn them off. And if I have a mobile app that uses an API in the backend to communicate to a backend service that is a public-facing API for interacting with that mobile app, how do I secure that? How do I ensure no one but my mobile app can communicate? And most importantly, not the mobile device, the mobile app can communicate, and that it can only communicate in ways that I want it to communicate. It's
or if it's
incredibly difficult thing.
Or that the pattern is so different, then you can recognize a different pattern than normal and quickly eliminate the source.
And that starts to become part of the problem, right? In talking to the researchers, the problem is I can't eliminate false positives and be effective in reality, right? Because I'll give you an example. So this actually happened. This was a security company doing a test against a bank's a service provided by a bank, which was just currency exchange. Right. And so it's I want to take currency from one nation's currency to another nation's currency. I pay a fee in between, and I exchange some dollars for some dollars, rounded to the nearest penny. Right. And so basically what they did was they Superman 3'd the whole thing, for those who are familiar with that. Or if you're not, they office spaced it. Rather than rounding down the penny, they kept the change that was left over. And the application, the client side application, had all of the validation built into it. Right. So it validated the number of transactions per minute. It validated that the service fee was included. It validated the currency and did the rounding for you. Right.
Wait, so I made a lot of money in there.
Right. So,
wow.
So all they did was ignore the client-side app and communicate with the backend API directly.
Right.
They didn't provide the cost of the currency exchange, so there was no fee. Right. They lowered the dollar amount, so there was no minimum dollar amount, because all they were looking for really was what would normally be rounded off, and they didn't round off to the nearest cent. They kept the change that was left over, those minor pieces of pennies, and then they executed it because there was no regulation on number of transactions per second. They then just executed it until they had roughly executed about $10 million in transactions, right? Before and that didn't trigger anything, because the bank's not looking for correctly formed API calls and correctly executed currency exchanges, all of which this passed. As long as it didn't exceed the amount of cash on hand, they were fine with it. They had no policy, procedure, software trigger, nothing to say, hey, you might want to take a look at this. It just looked like normal, completely normal traffic. as far as
Because they trusted the source, because the source was only the app to which I assume they would have
Correct.
tested in the past at some point.
Correct. Because
They didn't
made
presume one would make that headless.
correct, because they didn't think that someone would make that headless.
Yeah.
And the bitch was, as soon as they got to 10 million, they just flipped the currencies and did it the other way around, still keeping the change.
Right. They could keep going with hundreds of currencies, hundreds of transactions.
Correct. And it didn't matter because they would take currency away and refill the same currency. So ultimately, it was just the fractions of a penny that were being lost.
Right.
How many times can you execute that on $10 million? If all I'm doing is looking for a fraction of a penny, I could do it, I don't know, 40 million times.
Right.
Where the account is completely drained, at which point it still all looks like good traffic. Right. And now all I'm doing is going, how did I do 40 million in currency exchanges without collecting the fees for said currency exchanges? And someone has to be able to put that together, and it's kind of a manual process. All of that was legitimate traffic as far as all of the systems and checks and balances they had in place were set to execute. And if you think about it, security starts with default don't trust. Like, I don't trust that, so I'm going to build security in. Software development starts with the default of trust.
Right. Yes, because software development is about expediency, right? It's about delivering on the project.
Correct.
But so you've described a few problems, right? So let me see if I can bucketize for us here. So problem number one, we have a whole bunch of undocumented APIs readily available to be consumed, and any number of bad actors could consume them. That's problem number one.
Correct.
Problem number two is that there's a whole bunch of APIs that were poorly designed and implemented, and therefore could be abused by bad actors. Correct? Yep. And then number three, there's a whole bunch of APIs that even if designed well and even if documented, still could pose a problem because the control is still outside of the organization, especially if it's trustless.
As simple as filtering on the client side, which that's a lot of modern software design, right? I make a query to the API returns a ton of data, and then the client side filters it and discards the data it's not going to use. Right. Excuse me, wait, what? Right. The example I gave was, let's say you wanted to provide a component of your app that just gave the ETA of a delivery based on the order number. It is entirely reasonable that query is going to contain everything about the order, the source, the destination, the payment method, everything, right? That you haven't specifically excluded, as in isn't part of the record. And yet it's not likely to return just the receipt date, the expected receipt date. It's likely to return everything, and then the client will discard what's not being used. Mm-hmm. So what displays in the app is, your ETA is 3 days.
Right. Even though a whole bunch more information has been passing back and forth to support that.
Correct. And if you only think about it from the perspective of what data needs to be delivered to my app, and that's how my users are going to get to it, and I need to do it as quickly as possible, that is by far the most expedient way to do it. Just return all the data, and then and it's also not the same developers. Let's also be super clear on it, right? So when my front end developer tells my back end developer, hey, I need the tracking data, they don't know exactly what they're trying to get. Maybe they're just trying to get those 3 days. So they just return everything. They just return the entire order data. There you go. Just discard what you're not going to use. Sweet, dude. No problem. I'm on it. And in an hour, they have the feature added. Right. Versus, okay, but there's a ton of other stuff in the tracking data. Do you need all the tracking data? Like, what tracking data? Like, what are you passing me? What are you expecting to get as a response? How do I trim that down? How do I normalize that? How do I validate it? What is normal traffic? Like, all the questions that suddenly show up as the sec portion of DevSecOps mean I've now turned what could be an hour into 2 weeks. Right. Especially when I consider this isn't normal language used by either person on the phone, right? The game of telephone. hey, I need to tracking data. Sweet. Here's how you get track. Here's the call. I'll return all of it. Just discard what you don't need. Awesome, man. Let me know when it's done. Click. That's the totality of the phone call.
Right.
Right. And I don't like, I can deal with as the front end developer, I can deal with discarding the data and pulling out from this big record that they give me exactly what I need. No problem. They didn't ask any other questions. They don't need any other questions. And I've done what I need. And it's one phone call and it's done. And then the only time it comes up is if I go, crap, that's not actually in the order record. That's in this record instead.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Give me something else, and then you just multiplied it because now you have both the order transaction and the client transaction.
Correct. Versus how many times do we have to go back if neither one of us have a firm understanding of the security piece? And thus we have okay, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions. That goes to my security team. Then I ask another question and then ask another question, then ask another question. What does that do? Take it from an hour to 4 weeks?
So what's the to do here? There is no technology that exists that will scan an application looking for APIs.
So there actually is. There are
how is that possible when you have no idea what the structure of an API call might look like?
Because we do know what the structure of an API call looks like, because most of them are publicly documented.
Right.
And so again, most of them.
But the abandoned ones aren't, as you just described a few minutes ago.
Correct. But we also know what an API call looks like we know what an API call looks like when we see it on the wire. Right. So what a lot of companies are doing is they're using effectively they're doing packet inspection.
Yeah.
Right. And looking for API calls. Is it totally effective? No.
And that's only going to give you the ones that are currently being called.
That is 100% correct.
It will not tell you the 80 other commands this API could possibly call.
That is absolutely correct. But it does tell you an API exists.
Yeah.
It does tell you this is what a normal access pattern looks like.
Right.
Those two things are infinitely closer than where we were yesterday.
Fair enough.
Right. Yes. As we play the game of football and we look for a touchdown, you're nowhere near a touchdown. Right.
But at the very least, once you have that knowledge, that could be the constraint, right? To say, well, if it's not within this series of commands, then there's a problem and stop the transaction.
Correct. Yeah. Or it's not within this pace, or it's not from this location, or it's not insert thing here.
Right.
And what they're trying to do, and this is where I think it starts to get really interesting, is they're trying to determine heuristically what is the intent of the developer with this API.
Right.
And then if it doesn't match the pattern of intent, block the traffic.
Right.
Block the request, discard the packet. Right. It is, I've wickedly simplified, but it is actually simple. Right. It is fairly straightforward. Is it perfect? Not by any means. Right. However, I also don't have to train my developers.
Right.
I'm not doing code inspection. Right. I'm not attempting to inspect the source code that they're building. I'm not inspecting their Git repositories. I'm not changing their workflow in any way, shape, or form. I'm adding a layer to my security team.
But that's take away from that. You should do all the secure coding too. Like I wouldn't let him go.
But that gets us, but this stage gets us as close as we can to an immediate light switch.
Right. Sure.
Okay. Stage 2 is I need to stop pretending that DevSecOps is something that I do. Because if you don't have a method that does all of this inspection, if you don't have a process to certify APIs, you have a problem. Mm-hmm. If you're allowing your developers to just go to Stack Overflow and say, hey, I need an API to move this piece of data to here, I need something that returns this, then you're not doing DevSecOps. You're nowhere near it. You're a million miles away.
But is your APIs the problem here? Or is it the third-party software you installed in your data center the problem? Or the SaaS/cloud APIs that exist?
All of it.
All of the above.
That feels more dangerous to me than the ones that I built.
Yeah, but you're not really building APIs anymore. You're taking advantage of APIs that are part of an existing microservice that does this thing that you likely need. The number of times you write an API, not the call, but the API itself from scratch, at this point are effectively zero.
Well, if I'm building my own software.
Yeah, but even if I'm building my own software, I'm leveraging what's contained within other microservices to which I communicate that I did not write. I don't write RabbitMQ, and yet that's the messaging layer that
No, but you're controlling what commands your particular address scrubbing service will respond
only
to.
from the client in each case, not from the server, right? So all I'm controlling is what is the get command, as an example, look like,
Right.
not what are all the infinite possibilities of get commands to which RabbitMQ will reply.
Right.
And that's where the problem lies. Because all it takes is a bad actor to get access to that, and all of a sudden they can get everything.
Right. So then how do you control the third-party software and or third-party systems?
Well,
to deal with that.
they also, and that's where it transitions from API security. And let's call API security something that you can in fact take action on.
Sure.
I can take action on all those things. I can inspect the wire. I can have my software developers use far more rigorous security procedures, right? I can tightly integrate my DevOps with my security workflow so they become one DevSecOps workflow. Like I can control all those things.
Right.
But that's why software supply chain management really is the topic that everyone should be talking about, not API security. API security is a facet. And that's where we need to start having different conversations with the vendors to whom we give money or to whom we consume. In some cases, we may be consuming APIs that we're not paying for that are SaaS services. We still need to be as rigorous with that as we are with anything else.
Right. Or do you think we need to start demanding the same kind of constraints that we could do on ourselves?
We absolutely do.
All right. Contractually,
we absolutely.
Right, to say, we expect you to notify us when there's behavior outside of the norm.
100%.
Yeah.
Right. Matter of fact, we expect you to develop not one API, but multiple APIs, each of which have their own security, each of which do their own validation, each of which have their own checks and controls, right? We expect you to actually deprecate your unused commands as you start to replace them and not keep them around for legacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? We expect you to take security incredibly seriously to the point that honestly, that if they're not a current customer, as in they don't maintain their current code base, you're not screwing all the rest of us because you've kept commands in for 12 years because, well, we have a customer that won't update their API calls.
Right.
Okay, but that screws the rest of us because those API calls are legacy API calls that aren't secure, that aren't executed in the proper way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
We have to take action and we have to be far, far, far better, citizens of this ecosystem.
What happened when that customer is the one that have the biggest pocket? And they pay so they don't have to update their apps.
And you need to find another vendor. You need to find, and there are ways to deal with that, right? I could absolutely have a totally separate API with a totally separate endpoint that is updated and keep that legacy endpoint so it only accepts really, really, really structured API calls from a very specific series of source addresses. Right. And just say, look, I get you don't want to update your application, but you also have to know you can no longer use anything this way that's other than this application. If you're writing new code, you have to conform.
Right.
There are ways that you can mitigate. Solve? No, but we're not in the business of solving. And that's kind of an important thing to understand about security for all of our listeners, right? If you don't work in security, you may think the goal of security is to solve these things. You can never solve these things. The goal of security is to mitigate the risk of these things.
Right.
Because we've already accepted the bad guys are always going to be ahead of us. Right. So we have to make it hard enough. We have to make it complicated enough. We have to make it good enough that they pick an easier target.
You've got 50 years of implementing poor technology. We're way behind the bad actors.
Correct. I remember a long time ago, we had things like that. And now that you mentioned that, about 2 weeks ago, I was doing an API that their instructions returned a lot more information than what I needed. Now that you mentioned that, I was like, I'm getting a lot of information.
That's referred to as lazy programming.
So it's a bird, it's a plane. Are we screwed? Like literally,
Bird, it's a
what
plane,
can
it's all on fire.
the sky's falling? The sky's no.
But it actually goes back to the thing I opened with, right? Which is, how do we think about trust? And do we need to start thinking about trust and defining trust in a very, very, very different way, right? Now think about that for a minute. You trust your bank. You kind of don't have a choice. How much less do you trust your bank after this conversation when the one example I gave you was a real example from a real bank?
Mm-hmm.
And they're not unique.
I'm getting a bigger mattress.
Right? Like
So you're recommending a narrowing of the word trust, right? So trust up to this point has been, do you trust the source or destination, right? Is this on my one list that people I trust and the other list to which people I don't trust? But now trust definition is much more finite to say, not only is it the entity on the list, but how they're communicating, why they're communicating, when they're communicating, all the dimensions of the communication is all trust.
It's there was this big campaign when because we're all about the same age, when we were kids, because the AIDS epidemic was a thing. And there was this big campaign on AIDS. You're not just having sex with that person, you're having sex with everybody they've ever had sex with.
Right.
Okay. You're not just trusting their code, you're trusting everyone whose code they touch. Right? And so we need to start being better about trust. I can't just trust my bank because now I'm trusting my bank and everyone else. I can't just trust my hospital because I'm now trusting my hospital and every single service that they subscribe to. Do I have the ability to trust that? Should I trust that? Are there questions I should be asking? Are there questions I should be asking to determine, is that trust something that should be given or not?
Right. Well, Carlos, good chat.
Thinking about it, just as something that is very easy to go out to a GitHub repository or to Stack Overflow and ask for a question and get probably not ill intention. They're probably not doing something bad, but really thinking that when you just leverage one call, there may be a lot of other calls within the API that could be giving out information. So securing it, looking for it, is actually probably the next step. Like we have talked that the zero trust idea, not trusting everything that is on your network or around you. I think we have to start thinking about it in a different way, that not every call is good. So thinking about it, securing it will be probably what we need to focus on. My friends, it's been awesome to see you again. For everybody that's listening, or that is watching, make sure that you share, you subscribe, and we'll see you on our next episode.